Katharine, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Eliza. Is it Eliza or yes, it's
Yes,
Eliza. There's
Elisa,
only one way to
and
pronounce Eliza. Okay, got it.
unbelievable that you got that on the first try because I want you to know this has been the bane of my existence that my parents decided to spell my name in a non phonetic way. My husband called me Eliza for the first 6 months he knew me, and I still married him, which tells you how used to I am, people calling me the wrong name.
Yeah, yeah. No, I get it. I get it. I have a best friend whose husband announced at their wedding speech that he still didn't know how to pronounce her name properly. So
Whoa.
Caroline or Carolyn, but excuse me.
Must be a very complicated name for that. Wow.
No, it's Caroline or Carolyn, but I get this too with Catherine and Catherine. Anyway.
All right. Well, I'm thankful that you got my name correct, and so we're starting off on a great foot here. But Catherine, I want to talk with you about your incredibly interesting background. You started off at CNN and made your way through Huffington Post, the Washington Post, now this, and then you started your own company. So I am a sucker for people who have these that go through their career, part of their career, working for other companies and then start their own business. And I'm excited to talk with you about that. But let's start at the beginning. CNN. Why did you get interested in media?
Gosh, why did I get interested in media? Well, it just seemed like the center of action, and I was always worried about having a desk job. I was not great at concentrating and sitting in one place for a long period of time. And the news business really, on the surface, made it seem like I'd be running around and sort of chasing after people and getting interviews. And of course, that's what you're doing if you're, a reporter and you're in front of the camera. But the actual business of making the news is something that requires a huge amount of focus and a lot of time in studios. And so, but I loved my time at CNN. I interned there. I even went down to Atlanta thinking that I was going to become an in-bed going to the Gulf War. This was before, they had a formal internship program. And so I was an unpaid intern, which is a whole conversation around, equity and how some people can do that and some people cannot. So I was obviously very fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I did get a full-time job there, I my they put me on the overnight shift from 2 o'clock in the morning until noon every day, and it was a rough place. Like the control rooms are very. I don't know how much they've changed in the last 15, 20 years, but I remember shoes being thrown and people getting very, very angry because everything was live and everything was,
Yes.
one mistake really had huge repercussions. So
Mm-hmm.
the pressure, starting my career in that kind of pressure cooker was really tremendous. And frankly, I learned a lot around how to sort of handle people and emotions and very challenging situations. Um, and, but I do think that environment has changed. I would think it's a little bit like, I don't, I do hope that environment has changed. Um, I think it's probably akin to like what it's like to work in a top kitchen or
Mm-hmm.
where it's just time is of the essence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I moved on. I was pretty miserable working from 2 o'clock in the morning till noon every day, and so I decided to travel a little bit with my now husband, and we went to India, which was also an amazing wake up call.
Mm-hmm.
And came back to New York, and a really good old friend of mine was working on a project called the Huffington Report.
Mm-hmm.
Knew Kenny Lair, who was the founder of, who was co-founding it with Ariana, and he had me come in and work with him on writing all the headlines. And I was the sixth person I think at that time, and um, that was 4.5 years of just really it was a pretty grueling schedule. Two people running that homepage in the beginning, myself and my friend Alex McCallum, and we did it 24/7. We had
Yeah.
another person come in to help on the weekends, but um, that's another situation where you just realize the mechanics of getting something and building it quickly, and the sacrifices that you make when you're doing a startup. But I've always thrived in those sort of early startup roles. I was recruited to go run digital at the Washington Post, and it was much more of a strategic sort of people management role. And I floundered in that space because I wanted to get my hands dirty, and really preferred that. And to this day, I also I think I'm better at building and then growth stage. We're now entering into a growth stage at PowerToFly. I did the same thing with NowThis. I was the founding managing editor. But what's interesting to me from a leadership perspective is to know your space and where you're really you really do well. And we've actually hired some really strong operators at PowerToFly. We went out and raised about. I led the fundraising for a $30 million round starting this time last year. It took over 6 months. Luckily, closed it right before the market started to come down. And
congratulations.
Thank you. And we're now in that very tricky growth stage where the company is very, very different than it was 6 months ago, and has very different priorities, management criteria, everything. And so, I'm also at an interesting inflection point in my career as well.
Well, there's so much in there that I want to ask you about, but let's talk about PowerToFly for a moment, because I think it would be important for people to understand what is PowerToFly, what inspired you to create it, and you said it's different now than it was 6 months ago. Tell us a little bit about the evolution.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always changing, right? So it was interesting. I was talking to a mother at my son's preschool class this morning, who was like, I had taken my daughter, this is a slight aside, but relevant. I had taken my daughter to see Dr. Fauci speak last week. She's 9 years old, and she actually has the wherewithal. She's sort of lived through his career, right? And I mean, he's been around, he's 82, but lived through those seminal moments of COVID. And, what was so interesting is he said, people always want us to have the same facts for COVID, but the disease keeps changing, and how we respond to it keeps changing. And so therefore our response keeps changing. And that's the same thing with a business. And my comment to this mother was that when you're in upper management, when you're an executive, people get angry with you that you have to change and the company has to change. And something that you said was a plan 3 months ago isn't going to be a plan 3 months from today, because the facts on the ground keep changing.
That's right.
And so, you don't want to be in an airplane that doesn't change course when a storm comes, right? And we have to think that way with business as well. But I also think that people who run businesses have to change. And so when we started this company, it was very focused on, frankly, my problems and my co-founder's problems as a white woman. A white woman who's college educated, can work from home, and in highly technical roles. Well, that's a very, frankly, it's a small percentage of what it means to be a woman, clearly what it means to be an underrepresented person. And so, and clearly what needs to happen across, business, and also, candidate pools, in order to really reach the more equitable world that we're going for. So we evolved to be a platform that serves all underrepresented talent, all underrepresented genders, and people from different socioeconomic backgrounds as well, in education. Now we do focus on 5 to 10 years of experience, and that requires a certain degree of education, but we provide free education on the platform, because ultimately what we're doing is we're building a platform where talent and companies can not only connect around jobs, but we focus on 4 different sectors that lead to more equitable workplaces and more diversity and inclusion within these workplaces. And that's around attracting talent. So that's recruitment, marketing, hiring talent. That's obviously recruiting both on the inbound side and the outbound side. These are more specific talent acquisition HR terms, but we have to be very, very business focused. It can't be this idea that we don't talk about underrepresentation. We actually measure and we provide tools and a platform to close the gaps. Then we also talk about retaining talent. So we offer modularized courses on everything from listening circles to what you need to grow in your own career, and then growing talent is the fourth bucket, which I already just mentioned. But it has to be attract, hire, retain, and grow. Those four buckets, and it doesn't have to start with attract. We often start with working with companies when they want to retain and grow people, because especially in this market where so much hard won talent is, they don't, large corporations, we're seeing a lot of layoffs in the tech sector, obviously, about 200,000. Note, though, that we still have incredibly low unemployment, like 3.5% right now. But we are seeing changes in the tech sector. And so a lot of that talent that companies put so much energy and effort into finding over the last couple of years, they want to make sure that talent is also retained, the ones who are not part of the RIFs. So there's a lot of talent still within these organizations that need to be paid attention to.
And in terms of the work that you're doing, it's so the platform itself, the PowerToFly platform is helping to connect the talent pool with the companies that are searching for talent.
Yeah. So talent's free. Yeah.
And then you're offering services to the talent in order to help them be as successful as possible within that ecosystem of going and finding work that works for them, because we do know, and this is something that we have been talking about for a while, which is the Great Resignation, right? Where you had millions of women who were either forced to leave the workforce because their jobs were eliminated during COVID, or they couldn't sustain the roles that they were in because of their children at home. So in terms of that population, it's like an influx of people who are probably now looking to come back into the workforce.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. And I do want to say, like, the word services is always, it's very one-to-one, and we do provide, but what we have is a platform where millions of people sign up for events and things that they can take asynchronously. And then companies have a DEIB business suite where they can do everything from like sourcing to running events to meet talent. We have a big summit coming up on February 6th and 7th called Amplifying Back Excellence, and then a career fair tied to that as an example. So a lot of great stuff people can attend to. So to talk about the she session, or the Great Resignation. So it's just, okay, well, there's two things. The Great Resignation, right, is something that, okay, first of all, it's so interesting to me. I just want to do another aside. I'm reading a book right now called World Without End, and it takes place in the 1300s, in the 1350s, during the plague, right? And Ken Follett, who's amazing, wrote this in 2012. And the patterns around working that you saw that happened after the Great Plague are not too dissimilar from what you're seeing today, in the sense that a lot of people were accelerated out of the workforce, obviously. A lot of people died at much, much greater numbers. But what happened was, because there were so many fewer workers, and you saw wages actually go up, and you saw mobility among people who were traditionally tied to certain lands and serfs, right? They could actually go to the next town and go and get a higher wage because the next town was offering to pay for that. While, of course, lords and nobles came down on them very hard. But what's very interesting to me is you did see this Great Resignation, 2 years ago, where you had obviously some support come in, so people's savings rates were able to go up. and people didn't feel safe in a lot of working environments. And you had people age out of the population very quickly who decide to retire earlier. So, we had a lot of gap in workers, and that's still happening. We have 10 million jobs open, but now you're starting to see the wage increases because restaurants, for example, and the services industry need to pay more. So that's certainly happening. And I'm actually seeing some very promising signs where wage growth among demographics that traditionally have not had wage growth, like Black men, for example. I think the New York Times did an article about it. The wages increased by 11% in the last year. And obviously it needs to go up much, much higher, but that's in the service sector, right? So for jobs. Now, for women, we talked more specifically about a she session. And I was looking at some data this morning that what we're finding now is that college educated women are actually, their workforce participation, if they had children from the age of I have the figures right here. It's a different kind of story. It's if you actually had women who had college age children, I think from the age of 4 years old or younger, their actually workforce participation during the pandemic rose 4.7%. And that is because they finally had the flexibility to be at home and they had their spouses around. But what's really interesting is this didn't happen with women ages 5 to 13, where obviously you think about a little bit more of homework at home and things like that. So it's still a picture where you're actually seeing this interesting thing happening where women were finally able to work from home if they were college educated and had those roles. And because there was so much attention to hiring around these jobs that you could do from home, we had such a surge in hiring in the last 2 years, you actually saw growth in that area. But then women without college degrees really got hit worse because childcare shortages, they couldn't work from home. So what worries me now is less around women coming back into the workforce and that growth, but more around the gap that you're seeing between women, right? So that's scarier to me in the long run. And, how do we mitigate that? Because it's ultimately about education within the genders, right?
Yeah. So in thinking about, I am very curious to hear your perspective on going back to this concept. And I think one of the things that is hopefully evolving is the way that we have to work. That you talked about your experience at CNN, at Huffington Post, at the amount of work, and just the Huffington Post experience, because Ariane Huffington has subsequently written a book about the overworking and lack of sleep and the impact that has on us. I am very interested to get your perspective because you had a front row seat to that experience,
right,
watching it, but also experiencing it yourself. So can you talk a little bit about how you think work is evolving now that we have some understanding of what that type of work does to us, and how you think it's going to move forward, especially given the work that you're now doing with PowerToFly? What do we need to know about this in terms of the way we work? How is it going to evolve?
Well, I'm conflicted a little bit because the PR answer, the answer that'll get me a lot of hits on LinkedIn is employers need to know that they can't work people at these rates and X, Y, and Z. But when you're running a startup like we were with Huffington Post, you have a limited amount of funding to prove an idea. And that's the space you're in. So I knew what I was getting into. And I also knew that there were huge rewards that I could reap if and surely enough, we sold the company, and I think I was working at $40,000 back then or something, but I was probably working, 60 hours a week and nights and weekends. But what's so interesting to me about this dichotomy is that I was able to do that work. And I heard a Harvard economist who I've been listening to. Her name is, sorry, my facts and figures are not up here as much, but Claudia Golden.
Uh-huh.
Just wrote a book. She's a Harvard economist, leading scholar on women and work. And she talks about greedy work.
Mm.
This concept that some people can work, 10, 15 hours longer than others. And we know who those people are. Those are like, I mean, I went to school with a lot of them. Those are the analysts, the early analysts at Goldman Sachs. Those are the early lawyers. That
Mm-hmm.
sets you up for a future career.
Mm-hmm.
And that can, when you're my age, you don't have to work as hard because if you continue that cycle, right? Then obviously there's other people who are sort of working, doing that greedy work, if you will, underneath. And it's not greedy for the worker, it's greedy for the company that
Yeah.
basically can equate, twice as much work for not as many wages, right? But
Yep.
they can hold out that carrot.
Yep.
And so, I don't have a great answer for it because, again, I understand the limited resources that we have as startup founders. I will say that it's been my goal at this company, and with my co-founder Melena, who has 4 kids and I have 2. So and we have about 150 employees, is to always say we're running a marathon, not a sprint. And there
Mm-hmm.
have been times where we certainly have had to sprint and work really hard. And there was a weekend last year where my family went away and I had to stay here and do work because it was of the essence. But that, have I set up a company with that structure? No. My number one goal was actually to not set up a company with that structure. And one of the ways that I did that, because I've been in those structures before and I didn't want to live my 30s and 40s with young children doing that. So frankly, one of the ways that we've set that up is we've really looked at time zones of people and tried to keep the pass the baton
Mm-hmm.
situation going
Mm-hmm.
so that people can pick up work. You don't have to be on call. Look, if something happens with the site, if you're in New York at midnight, because we have people who are in the Far East, for example, who are on different schedules. So it
Mm-hmm.
starts with where you're hiring people, how you're hiring people.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also starts with setting up really strong systems
Yeah.
that people can go to themselves versus bothering each other. So I made it a policy of myself, because this happened to me for 10 years and I still get triggered when people call me on the weekends. I don't call people on the weekends. I
Mm-hmm.
don't email them on the weekends.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was growing up in the work world, it was like a sign of this sort of very sick, like,
Yes.
productivity, that I could email someone back at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning.
Yes.
And I would get celebrated by a boss. If someone does that to me now, I say, "Are you kidding me?" First
Right.
of all, I don't do it. But if I were to do something, I usually, what I do now is I send someone an email, not on the weekends. I say, "This is when I kind of need an answer on this, because this is when
Mm-hmm.
my meeting is." Or when I ask someone to do a project for me, if I Slack them, I say, or when I need to see something, I say, "Hey, I need this information." But I say, "I'm going to the dentist this afternoon until 6. So I'll likely look at it tomorrow morning or something,
Mm-hmm.
or in 2 days." But like, it's not terrifying people with time zone expectations. Because I have certainly, I mean, we've all worked very, very hard on something and the boss doesn't even look.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we've given up, we've sacrificed other things. So it's about structure. And sometimes you do have to work, incredibly hard, but there are ways you can structure your workday and how you communicate with people if you're a boss,
Mm-hmm.
that alleviates so much pressure and does a lot with work life integration balance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then it's also having like a clear structured system, because we all hate this. Terrible leaders are ones who react to things quickly, right? And so, and you don't want to set up your team doing that as well, and
Mm-hmm.
that creates greedy work.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you brought up some of the points that we're talking about, because my observation, and I've been in the workforce. I started out at a very large corporation. Spent the first half of my career there, and the concept of FaceTime, and I don't mean the app on your phone, but like sitting in there, being in your office to be
Right.
seen. I feel like that was a huge part of
Yeah.
what drove success, and heroic acts like, oh, you're on maternity leave, but we need you to go to Asia when, 2 months into your maternity leave. And if you do that, you'll be rewarded greatly, which is a very personal situation that happened with me. But I think the thing that's changed over time, and I think COVID did hasten this. For somebody like me running a startup, I felt like this concept of FaceTime, this concept of we all have to be sitting and wasting all this time in an office together. Yes, there are some businesses, absolutely, that you need people together in a space
Mhm.
during, especially in certain periods of time. But a lot of businesses can run remotely.
Yeah.
And I think that COVID helped companies see this. And what that did was it eliminated a lot of the extraneous stuff, like
Right.
the FaceTime, like the commuting, however much time you spent commuting. And it's not just the physical amount of time, it's the emotional, the share of mind.
Right. Right.
Oh, I got to get up.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
things have evolved. They've shifted.
Right. 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 So, I mean, if we go back to 2019, that's where you're going to start seeing more women, college educated women leave the workforce.
Mhm. Mhm.
And um, yeah. So, because another, thing that Claudia Golden said that I thought was really interesting is like the cost of flexibility actually went down dramatically during the pandemic. And one thing, I mean, we've been remote since 2014. Actually, one of the ways we built the tech team at Huffington Post back in 2005 was having a remote team that actually allowed us to scale. And a lot of organizations like the New York Times, Washington Post were like, "How do they do it?" Well, it was remote. And frankly, I wasn't going to be able, just running the homepage of the Huffington Post. I had to work from home a lot there's
Mhm.
no way I would get on a news story if I was commuting.
Mhm.
Um, but there's two things that really changed the world, unfortunately, and it's war and it's pandemic.
Mhm.
And so as much as I was preaching the beauties of remote, because people would often say to me before 2020, like, yeah, but that's going to set women back if they're not in the office. Well, you
Mhm.
needed a global pandemic to literally get people to change their behavior. And that's the sad truth. But,
Mhm.
um, you know, we want to go back to society in the way it was in many ways. But there are certain parts of it. And I love being with people too in offices periodically. But what you're seeing now is this adjustment with companies that's very positive.
Mhm.
Um, Especially for women who can work remotely.
Mhm.
Um, and then obviously we have a lot of other work to do when it comes to women who need childcare, women who have service jobs. And, like I said, luckily there's pressure in those industries for wages to go up, and it is hitting consumers, and you're seeing inflation. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next year, and hopefully we don't go into recession there.
Mhm.
But we have 10 million jobs open, right? And so if we want more women to get into those roles, we need to be focused on childcare. And then if we want more women to get into the roles that you can do remotely from home, which allows you in certain cases to have a child around or pick up a child from school. Again, you can't have like a 3-year-old running around while you're working. It's impossible. I'm not
Mhm.
advocating for that. But then we have to think about education as well and skilling
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about where you see work 3 years from now, right? So we've had this evolution since COVID,
Yeah.
uh, for that I think is a massive shift. Just in my having been in the workforce for a
Yeah.
long time before that, I definitely see this huge shift in how people think about employees, and
Hmm.
and even just employees having more personal agency, which I think is one of the biggest gifts that COVID has given employees,
Right.
in the sense that, you know, think about this idea that you had to be in an office, and what were the concerns? Oh, well, if you're not there, maybe you're not working. There is a shift in how employers think about employees, right? Like, I have to give my employees that ability to have that personal agency, and I think that's extraordinarily empowering. So for me, as just as an observer, I think that's been a huge shift. But
Right.
what do you think is going, like, so here we are today,
Yeah.
3 years, almost 3 years into COVID. How are things going to evolve from here?
Yes, you will see a lot of companies continue to be okay with remote and hybrid situations.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, you have seen a number of big banks try to get people back in New York and places like that because they have big real estate footprints. I think what'll be interesting is, uh, which will be the downside, is you're going to see a lot more sort of employee, um, well, downside and upside depending on how you look at it. So measurements around employee productivity. Like I personally like to measure my productivity and show people, I do a Pomodoro timer, I keep lists. I think there's anxiety as a work from home person when you're not being seen of like, what am I contributing to this company, right? And
Hmm.
so where are my contributions on a daily basis? Now the cons are like keyboard tracking and things that really have actually seen a rise during COVID. That frankly like don't account for a lot of the work that people are doing. Like it wouldn't account for this conversation I'm having right now.
Right.
So these things are coming, and I like to give pros and cons because you have to understand what's the upside and the downside in order to figure out how you're going to react to it as a business or as an employee, and how businesses see it. I think so. And then I also think there's going to be a lot of technology around like how people are using spaces, right? So because of hybrid, you're going to see like a lot of space tech, right? Property tech arising. So that's a prediction there. Um, in my space in particular around DEIB, you're going to see much more of a focus on data, right?
Hmm.
And not as much talk. Like there's I think, understandably so, companies, um, we there's been a lot of good pressure put on companies to change,
Hmm.
but companies are companies and they operate on spreadsheets and data points,
Hmm.
and you cannot put a, a sentiment out there, a very strong sentiment that is very much needed, and have it last and have it be effective and create impact if you are not quantifying it and showing ROI. And so my big focus and what we're doing with a lot of the funding is really turning PowerToFly into data intelligence platform around DEIB. Like I need to know, you know, what a company's starting point is when it comes to hiring underrepresented talent, what their retention rates are. So we're collecting all that data. And then on the flip side, on talent who are obviously opting in, we're knowing what messages are working, what courses they want to take,
Hmm.
what jobs they're responding to. Um, I frankly I don't spend much time on LinkedIn anymore because it's a lot of talk about things and not a lot of data and not a lot of facts. And so
Hmm.
it's, I came from the media space where the loudest person with the most provocative statement could get people to pay attention, but it's frankly very distracting
Yes.
to the real work that needs to be done. And that's what scares me a little bit in our space. And I think that's going to get tightened up in the next 3 years because there's just not as much money as there was before going to
Right.
DIB. So it's going to really separate. Like a lot of companies that we're dealing with are going to want very focused single platform solutions,
Hmm.
uh, and get down to the brass tacks of the work that needs to be done.
Right. Well, and also let's be frank, the appetite that companies are going to have for these types of for these types of things over the long haul is going to change based
Yeah,
on business performance. That is just the reality.
yeah,
And and I think the sooner we can, as you said, be more focused on what does the data show and what does it really mean? Not, I mean, because you can make data, as somebody who's done research for a very long time, you can make data look different depending on the story you want to tell. And so the question is, what does it really mean, and what's really important, and going to move the needle.
right.
So
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 I mean, I say this about every company that we deal with. Every company is starting from a different place and has very different needs, and they're in a different place. Like, well, starting from the same thing, but just on population demographics. When we used to work with companies in the Bay Area, they would say, those companies are very dialed in on their data. They know exactly, where they need to do more work with certain groups of people, et cetera. But what was interesting is like, you just can't make people move to the San Francisco Bay Area, for example. Remotes alleviated that, but you also can't make people get an education that is a 5 to 10 year education in 1 year. So, we just have to be realists about timelines, and any company that, says, I need this XYZ, we say, well, wait, let's look at where you are, what the reality of your situation looks like as a company, and then we'll make a timeline of how to get there.
Yeah.
And that's how we can do it. And what the investment is required in being, but it's a people data problem, and it's a human problem. And that's the hard part, the human problem of talking to people, making people sort of feel comfortable and as if they're, feel comfortable to be heard. It starts with the companies obviously creating inclusive spaces that are centered around belonging. And so we have to start from there, but we often have to reach out to thousands of people to say, I know you've never considered this workplace. Here's what they're doing to try to change. And here are the facts around what they're doing to try to change. And then we solve that by bringing in more people who get to check them out. But that's also a numbers data game, right? So,
yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see what persists. I mean, that's what I'm always interested in. Sometimes the pendulum swings very far in one direction until, you sort of get back to, well, what's going to be the ongoing. And it'll be very interesting to see what of the changes that have happened over the last few years, where is sort of the balancing point of that, and what will continue and what will go by the wayside.
I mean, I'm excited for it, sort of a balance, right? Because I do think that a lot of companies have reacted quickly as they should have, but now they're saying, what is the real work that we need to be doing? Where are the investments?
Yeah.
What are the platforms? Versus, how can we get through this crisis communications moment? That'll overwhelmingly help people in the long run.
Yeah.
Versus answering the loudest, situation that's happening around them. And so I do hope that, I feel like just even saying this, I'm going to get some backlash about like, oh, we got, and I'm not saying, that anything that people say in social movements and are not incredible. I mean, that's how we've gotten so far. And that's the first stage. But we gotta make sure that the work is really happening, and that comes with the more boring stuff.
Right. Well, and ultimately, what resonates and what's real. And
Right.
that is the deciphering of that is the tricky part. And I appreciate that you're bringing this up because, I don't think a lot of people are. And it makes sense given what you're doing and what you're building with PowerToFly, that this is on your mind. And I think it needs to be the next part of the conversation.
Right. Like, show me the data.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm the first person. I spent 10 years building a career on if it bleeds, it leads. So,
so, firsthand.
Yeah.
Well, I always end with one question, the same question that I love to ask. What do you wish you could tell your younger self that was just starting out?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to go back to as the facts change, the humans change. So I'll give myself a little bit of leniency on my younger self, but, I would say for the most part, people are trying to help you and don't take things as personally or get, worried about things, and listen to understand, listen to learn, and really, experience does matter.
Oh yes.
And when people are giving you that time, it might seem a little lectury and annoying, but they have something that money can't buy, and that's time on you, and see, because so much of our lives are lived through cycles, as you pointed out. And I mean, I'm like going back to the 1300s here.
Mhm.
But just to have someone, I don't know, my dad the other day was like, oh, SPACs, which we know what's happened with SPACs. He's like, he was used to be in finance. He was like, there was a SPAC craze 10 years ago, and the same thing happened. And actually, like Ray Dalio, who's a big hedge fund guy, writes about just history. It does repeat itself. And I think even in our own space, in the DIB space, we can learn a lot from it while being innovative, but also respecting like what we've seen happen in these cycles. And so you're literally seeing, what's happening with COVID sort of happen
Yeah.
like 700 years ago, right? So in very different ways, but still.
Right. And I think that the human condition is one that of optimism we always hope that it's going to be different this time, right? That even though history repeats
Yeah.
itself, we hope that there's something new that's going to be different. And that probably is true on average over time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm an optimist too. Like, I wouldn't be an entrepreneur if I weren't an optimist, if I didn't think that what I was building is going to help and work out. I do think that COVID in the long run will create some real demographic shifts. So I mean, I talked about wage growth, for example, in populations that have not seen wage growth. Like, that is data that we're seeing increase there. And I've also talked about, college educated women staying in the workplace and some of them coming back in. Very interesting lecture I heard. I listened to a lot of lectures from old guys and old women. It's very important, and younger people too across the board. But like the St. Louis Fed was saying that he thinks that because so many people, you're seeing a lot of layoffs in the tech industry. It was incredibly competitive, very hard to hire technologists before because they were getting scooped up at very competitive rates at Meta and other places and Google. Now you're seeing big, reductions of workforce there, but it's, again, compared to the overall population, 200,000 people about, compared to, I might have my numbers wrong a little bit there, so don't quote me on that. Sorry, but but anyway, it's much smaller percentage compared to the overall open jobs in the population. But what's really interesting is that we'll probably see a shift because people are getting hired very quickly from these tech jobs into other sectors.
Right.
Probably going to see a shift of really good technologists into very tech-starved sectors that need a lot of help, like healthcare, like other companies that we need as a society, right? So that's really like that actually is not net positive, could be very interesting on the long run. And again, I'm not saying people getting laid off is a good thing at all. It affects my industry too, and we're having a bit of a recession and recruiting. But again, you got to like think about 10 years, 12 years out versus the immediate headlines. So.
Yeah. Well, Katharine, I am so grateful for your time and your thoughts. It is a area that is begging for innovation, and I, for one, am so happy to see you in it. Just based on our short conversation, we need more people like you in this, like really trying to deal with this problem. And so I'm grateful, and thank you for spending the time with us today.
I'm honored to be asked. So. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.